In this video, I'm going to break down my approach to creating the portraits on a dark background for my Tattoos of Asia project. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video about the portraits from my Tattoos of Asia project. Now, in this video, I want to run you through the first type of portrait that I make for almost every single subject that I meet, and that is a simple close-up portrait on a dark background. Now, if you want a little bit more background on why I choose to photograph the people that I meet in this way, take a closer look in my previous video, which I'll link here for you. Now, in a nutshell though, the goals are to eliminate all distractions and focus your attention solely on the tattoos and the faces that they're on without any other context. Now, these images are designed to be a record of the people that I meet for this project. The first step towards making one of these portraits is to find a location that offers a flat wash of light over the subject for my strobe to augment. Now, sometimes we're lucky and we get a cloudy day, but most of the time I have to seek it out, and most of the time I have to seek out a location that's very, very close to my subject and where I met them, because often they're getting on in their years and they're not as mobile as they once were. So I'm often looking to, the doorway of their home or an awning that I can basically use to block that overhead light and create a shaded area. That gives me a good starting point for the images that I want to create. The next step is to choose how much of that light I want to use in my final exposure. So when I first started this project, I was a bit of a blunt instrument and I was just trying to knock out all of the ambient light and overpower everything with my speed lights. And when I couldn't make that work, I even spent some time in post-production darkening backgrounds so everything would be perfectly uniform. Now, I now find myself re-editing a lot of those images in order to fit them in with the current set of images that I'm making. Now, over time, I found myself wanting to keep a little bit more detail in the shaded side of my subject's face and have a little bit more wiggle room to basically pull out a little bit of detail in my backgrounds if I wanted to. These days I find that a good starting point for me is around 2 stops or maybe just a little bit more underexposed from what would be a good exposure for their skin in that ambient light. And once I've established my location and my base exposure, it's time to start thinking about bringing in that strobe light to light the face from one side and give it a little bit of shape. Sometimes when I have enough space, I can place my strobe in the exact position that I want it and achieve the exact image that I have in mind. But sometimes I find myself in cramped spaces with a subject who doesn't want to leave, or sometimes with a subject that isn't willing to give up too much more of their time, so things have to be done when and where we stand very, very quickly. Generally speaking though, I'm trying to get the light in a place where it gives some sort of shape to the subject's face and it doesn't spill too much onto the background at all, and that way I have control over the light on the subject as well as the light on the background independently. Now, my camera and light are both fully in manual mode at this point, so once I have things locked in, I can begin to focus on what's really important, which is communicating with my subject and working towards an image that expresses something about the time that we spent together and the conversation we had. So let's run through a couple of examples and discuss the specifics of each one. In this first image, we'll look at a portrait of a man by the name of Wanghan Wangsa, who is a Wancho man and lived through the time when his people were constantly at war with neighboring villages. He was a very quiet man who would often sort of just look off into the distance as he spoke, and he shared some really good insights into the different tattoo patterns of his people, being able to signify which clan a man belonged to. Now, it was these two things that would eventually lead me to make the portrait the way that I did. Now, when we met him, he was sharpening his machete in front of his home, and this is not his home, but it is a good representation of a Wancho house, and basically the sort of situation that we found ourselves in. We sat in the shade right in front of the house, and had only a couple of meters of working distance between him and the house. When it came time to make the portrait, I left him where he was, but I turned him so that his back was facing the house, And in order to get that extremely dark background, we opened the door of his house so that I could basically use the dark interior as my background. While the outdoor walls of the house were only a couple of meters away and might be affected by the flash or the ambient light, the depth of the interior was several stops under my current exposure and far too far away for the flash to have any effect at all. Doing all of that resulted in this as my ambient exposure. Now, if we look closely at his eyes, we can still see the sky and the harsh sun being reflected off the ground. Now, this gives a fairly even wash over his face and could definitely be used to create a nice portrait on its own. In fact, since we're using a GFX with plenty of dynamic range, let's give that a quick edit and take a look at what it would have looked like if I'd exposed correctly in the ambient light. Honestly, I like this, and I'd be happy to share it, but there are a couple of issues that stand out to me. The first is that obviously I won't be able to find this light all the time for this project, so I won't be able to recreate this image repeatedly. And the second is that the color of the light that's bouncing off the ground isn't really what I want. It takes on that sort of warm orange or brown hue of the soil beneath and bounces that back up into the shadows on his face. And it almost looks like he's being lit from below with a warm light, which really isn't something that I would like. So, quickly adding a pop of flash to my original exposure, we solve both of these issues. The light is now coming from a much more natural direction, and the reduction in the ambient exposure allows me to darken the shadows enough that that reflected light from the ground is no longer a major component of the image. The other things with light from a flash is that we can control exactly where it's coming from, and we know exactly what temperature it's going to be. So we can essentially use it to clean up the color and direction of daylight as well. So simply replacing the existing daylight gives us predictable color and predictable direction. So we can put it in a position where it gives a nice shape to the subject's face and at a distance where it creates the kind of shadows and highlights that we would want to give that sort of modern feeling that I was looking for in these images. Now, at this point, I've got my location settled and both my ambient and flash exposures dialed in. So now it's time for me to actually make the portrait that I'm after. So once I've done a few exposures, tossed in a couple of jokes through my translator to basically put my subject at ease, I can have him do what I was initially intending to, based on the time that I spent with him during our interview. And I wanted him to be looking off into the distance, exactly as he was during our interview. Now, this says a couple of things about him. It tells me a little bit about who he is and that sort of contemplative man that he was during our interview, and it also gives me a look into the side of his face, which is where you can see the unique tattoo of his people. So that gives you a good look into the man that I spent time with that day. Now, in a much quicker example, I'd like to share with you why it is that I always take a piece of black cloth or felt with me to use as a background on these trips. Now, when I met Laisishi, who is a Makuri woman, she was preparing to go out and tend to her fields, and we needed to quickly make our portrait in her home before she left. So, as you can see from the background of this image that we took together, we had the perfect ambient light at her doorway, but her home had hundreds of tiny gaps in the bamboo walls that would produce little bokeh balls all across my background that would eventually just distract from her face. So I followed the same procedure as before to place her and set my ambient light. Now, this time she sat in her doorway and got that beautiful wash coming in from outside with no light coming from above, but I had one of my companions for the trip step inside her house and hold my large sheet of black cloth to cover up any light coming through her walls from behind. And by doing that, I ended up with this clean slate to add my strobe to. From there, it was just a case of adding the flash to bring up my exposure to where I wanted it. Now, again, if you look into her eyes, you can see that bright blue sky and the reflected light from the ground, giving that same effect as before. Now, the flash doesn't overpower these, it just augments them, giving sort of a little bit of clarity to the light, a little bit of polish that didn't exist with the ambient light. Finally, we asked her to recall a story that she'd told during her interview that had made her smile at the time, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment, and this resulted in a photograph that represents my time with her very, very well. So that's a closer look into the portraits that I make for this project and how I create them. Now, it's a very simple process that's designed to make sure that my images are repeatable no matter where or when I meet my subjects. Now, I hope that it's been helpful for you, but please do let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Now, in the next video, I'm going to be taking you through a little bit more of a complex thing where we involve a little bit more of the scenery and the ambient light for some environmental portraits and essentially how we create those as well. So please do subscribe if you haven't already so that you don't miss that. As always though, thank you for watching and enjoy the slideshow.